You ever noticed that when you are seeing a commercial for a new food product, it's always like farmers out in the field picking fresh produce, and never a bunch of workers in a factory or scientists conjuring up some chemical. Because they want us to believe, as we see this, that if we buy their product, it's fresh, or they'll use words like organic and hand-picked. Those are words that sell things to you. They make you think they're authentic, they're real, they're genuine. One of the greatest tricks that the food industry has done is with something called truffle oil. You've heard of this probably, right? Truffles are one of the few products that scientists have not figured out how they can mass produce. And so the only way we can get them is organically, where they actually grow. They grow mostly in places like France and Spain, and they have a very short season. They use these dogs to sniff them out. And when they dig them up, they're very valuable then. There's a truffle a few years ago that sold for $330,000. And so, as they're cousins of mushroom, they're just this fungus. But if you're a truffle expert, what you know is this. The moment that you pick that truffle, as soon as you pick it out of the ground, immediately it begins to lose its potency and flavor. And the longer before you use it, the more of its flavor and potency that it loses. And so there's a very short season that you can actually use it and get that flavor. So, when you go to the store and you buy some truffle oil, what would you expect to be inside of that oil? Truffles, correct? There are a few that might have some remnants of truffles in them, but by and large, they have nothing from truffles in them. They are olive oil with this chemical that if I said its name, you wouldn't recognize, but the chemical mimics some of the scent of truffles. That's it. That's what most truffle oil is. Olive oil that kind of smells like truffles. But because of some of our rules, companies are allowed to put that label on it and say that it's hand-picked, that it's organic, that it's all those things, even though it's none of those things. So what the label says that it is, and what it actually is, are two very different things. For the last few weeks, we've been talking about what it means to follow Jesus, what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. And as we've explored some of what that means, I wanted to take a little different route this week and look at a scripture where Jesus clearly says what it does not mean to follow him, what it doesn't look like. And what he says here in Matthew 23 is that there are people who wear the label of being a follower or disciple of Jesus. They wear the label of being someone who lives for God. But the truth is, there is no God in them. They're labeled that way. They might look that way to most of us. But if we were really able to look at their ingredients and see what they were really made of, we'd find that the only remnants of Christ in them are manufactured. And they might have the vague scent of him, but they have none of him actually. And it's a challenge for us today to examine our hearts and ask ourselves that question. Am I really made of the things of God? Am I really a follower of him? Am I really a disciple of him? Or do I just like to wear the label and pretend that I'm one of his, when really I don't really know him? In this passage in Matthew 23 that Dennis read for us, we see that Jesus is not fooled. He's ripping off those labels, and he's exposing people around him for who they really are. And here in that passage, specifically, he calls out the Pharisees. Now, when we say the word Pharisee in the church today, we typically mean it as an insult, right? Nobody ever says they're a Pharisee and means something good. However, in Jesus' day, this was not an insult. In fact, a Pharisee was highly esteemed. They were looked up to. They were seen as those who were righteous. They were the experts of the law. They studied God's laws more than anyone else. They prayed more than anyone else. They tithed more than anyone else. They fasted more than anyone else. They did all of the things that if you were looking at the label, you would say, that is somebody who follows God. And Jesus here is saying, that's not who they are. He starts by saying this. They, as Dennis's version said, they sit on the seat of Moses, meaning they are in a place where they should teach, and they know the law. Notice he says, listen to what they teach. They know what they're talking about. However, don't do anything they do. Because while they might know what they're talking about, they don't actually live it in their lives. They teach one thing and they live another. So follow this passage quickly. He says, don't follow their example. They don't practice what they preach. Instead, they overburden people with religious demands. He says everything they do is a show. It's an act. They're pretending. He says they love the seat of honor. They love to be in places where they are seen and recognized. He says they love lofty titles. They love to be recognized and seen as important. He talks about these phylacteries, which are like these boxes they would wear on their head with verses or words in them, to show off how holy, how much we know, how long the braids of the robes were, because the longer they were, the closer they were to God. They wear the right clothes, they do the right things, they say the right things, and he finishes by saying, those who are exalted will be humbled. Those who build themselves up will be brought down to earth. And then that's what Jesus proceeds to do. He humbles these Pharisees. He calls them out. He calls them two things. We're going to start looking at these verses in verse 13. He calls them hypocrites. That's a word we still use. And we understand what that means in our language. What that word means in the Greek is an actor. They are playing a part. They are pretending to be something. And number two, he calls them blind guides. Meaning they're supposed to be leading people, but they're blind, so they do not know where they're supposed to go, nor do they know where they are leading you. And continuously, Jesus keeps using these insults about the Pharisees. He gives them, the title in your Bible may say the 7 woes. And you might read that word woe in there many times. In the version I'm reading, it says, what sorrow awaits. Jesus is warning them of what's coming if they continue to live this life that is just pretend, that doesn't actually seek God, but just acts like it. What this life will lead to if they continue to be blind and don't know where God is or how to get to him, but pretend as if they know. And so in this, I want to look at 4 different warning signs, warnings that Jesus gives about hypocrisy, what hypocrisy looks like. So we can look in our lives and say, listen, the Pharisees didn't realize they were hypocrites. And Jesus is trying to open their eyes, to knock those scales off so they're not blind anymore. These are warning signs for us to think about, am I a hypocrite? They are not warning signs for you to figure out who the hypocrites are in your life. That's easy. We can all do that. We all have them. These are warning signs for you, for me to look at my life and say, am I living? Am I pretending? Am I blind and don't know where I'm going? How can I figure out if I'm really following, if I'm really seeking after God, or if I just look like it? So the first warning sign we see in verse 13, and that's this: hypocrisy affects other people. Jesus starts by saying, "What sorrow awaits you teachers of religious law and you Pharisees, hypocrites! For you shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. You won't go in yourselves, and you don't let others in either. What sorrow awaits you teachers of religious law and you Pharisees, hypocrites! For you cross land and sea to make one convert, and then you turn that person into twice the child of hell that you are yourselves. Blind guides, what sorrow awaits you." So here, Jesus begins by saying that they are not bringing people into the kingdom of heaven. They are turning people away from the kingdom of heaven. How they live, how they talk about God, how they teach about God, how they tell people about God does not encourage people to follow him. Instead, it discourages them. And if they do convert them, they become just like them. Notice Jesus calls them children of hell, not children of the kingdom of heaven. They aren't leading them to God, they're leading them away from God. Who we are as we pursue God, whether we're pursuing him rightly or wrongly, affects other people. It doesn't just affect you in your life, it affects everyone around you. There is no neutrality in how you live for God. You might think, the world tells us this. In fact, I'm going to live out my truth. You live your truth, right? I'll be me, you be you, and we'll be happy together. But that's not how it works. Who I am influences and impacts who you are. Who I am in my life influences and impacts your life. We are all in this together. And if who I am is pursuing a path that's leading away from God, I'm going to encourage you to follow in the same path. I'm going to lead you in the same way. So we have to look at our lives and say, how does how I live, how does how I speak, how does how I treat people, how does it affect their lives? Does it bring them closer to God, or does it turn them away from him? And here's the conviction for you, church. The world around us calls us hypocrites. It's the most common label that the world around us will use of the church. And I believe, we like to say, well, you're right, we're all hypocrites, right? Which is true. We all do things that are wrong. We all don't always live up to the standards. But I want you to ask this question: is who we are in following God leading more people to him or away from him? Is who we are and how we live for him and love each other causing people to say, whatever it is that they got, I want some of that? Or are they saying, whatever it is they got, I want to get as far away from it as I can? Because if that's who you are, I promise you, you're not following Jesus. We're following ourselves. How our lives lived for Jesus affect others shows us whether or not we're genuinely, authentically living for him or not. We pick up in verse 16, where Jesus said, "Blind guides, what sorrow awaits you, for you say that it means nothing to swear by God's temple, but it is binding to swear by the gold in the temple. Blind fools, what is more important, the gold in the temple that makes the gold sacred? And you say that you swear by the altar, and that's not binding, but to swear by the gifts on the altar is binding. How blind! For which is more important, the gift on the altar or the altar that makes the gift sacred? When you swear by the altar, you are swearing by it and by swearing on it. When you swear by the temple, you're swearing by it and by the God who lives in it. When you swear by heaven, you are swearing by the throne of God and by the God who sits on the throne." So, probably nobody has any idea what that's talking about, right? It's not something that we do. So let me bring this to you. What hypocrisy does is it majors in the minors. Here's what they did. When the Pharisees would take an oath, they would swear on the temple. Much like we might tell somebody, do you swear on your mother's grave? Right? We hear those kind of expressions all the time. Not just do you swear, do you promise, do you swear on this? They would swear on the temple. And the people would say, well, if they're swearing on the temple, then they must be real, it must be genuine, it's a binding oath. Well, then the Pharisees would not do whatever they promised they would do. They would go against it. And they said, yes, we swore by the temple, but we didn't swear by the gold in the temple. And that's the real binding oath. The temple had a lot of gold in it. The temple was like a bank, a treasury for them. They saved their most precious things there. And so what they were saying is this. Listen to what that means. They're saying what gives the temple meaning is the gold we store in it, not the God who lives in it. Same thing when Jesus begins to talk about them swearing here, not just by the temple, but by the altar in the temple. And notice he says, they swear by the altar, they do the same thing. They turn around and say, well, I swore by the altar, but I didn't swear by the gift. You didn't specify which kind of gift it was on the altar. And only certain gifts have meaning. And Jesus is arguing, it's not the gift that gives the altar significance, right? It's not what's put on the altar. It's the altar itself, the altar of God. So essentially what the Pharisees were saying is what gives the temple meaning and what gives the altar meaning is what I bring to it, not the one who gave it to us. And what Jesus is saying here is clear in the next passage here, where he keeps going, and he says, this is verse 23, what sorrow awaits you, teachers of religious law, and you Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are careful to tithe even the tiniest income from your herb gardens. But you ignore the most important aspects of the law, justice, mercy, and faith. You should tithe, yes, but do not neglect the more important things. Blind guides. You strain your water so you won't accidentally swallow a gnat, but instead you swallow a camel. Now, Jesus says here that the Pharisees, as I said in the beginning, they were noted for things like their tithing. You remember a few passages ago we looked and the disciples of John the Baptist came to Jesus and said, why don't your disciples fast like we do and like the Pharisees do? There were these outward actions they did that they were very proud of. And what they did was, let's say, there's this hot honey rub that I like to use on things I grill now, okay? So what they're saying is I buy this hot honey rub and I bring it home and I pour it out in a bowl and I weigh it. And I say I got, 8 ounces of this. So I need to take 10% of this and put it in a baggie and bring it to church on Sunday. Because that's how holy I am. I even give up my hot honey rub to God, right? So Jesus is saying you guys are more concerned about if you've given the right amount of your oregano garden to God than about things like justice and mercy and faith. You're not concerned about the things that actually matter. You're not concerned with how you're living towards others. You're not concerned with how you're treating the poor. You're not concerned with how you love people who are hurting. You're just concerned, did I tithe all of my basil? That's it. And you think that makes you righteous. And he's saying to them, you care about these little things. And notice he says, tithe away, do it. Yes, you should do that. But if you think doing that is more important to God than how you love the person that you walk by while you carry that to the temple, you've missed the point. You're focusing on the minor things instead of the important things. Why? Why do we do that? We like to focus on the things we're already good at, not the things we're not good at. Because if we focus on the things we're not good at, that means we have to change. We do this too in American Christianity. We focus on sins that are not our problems. They're the world's problem. Let's look at the world, and that's finding things that are wrong in the world, and let's talk about those every week. Because then if we talk about them, you don't have to look at yourselves. And we don't have to look at our own hearts and lives. And I can keep living however I want to and keep doing the little things that I think make me righteous instead of really looking at my heart. Instead of really having to show justice and mercy and kindness and love to people that may not look and act and believe the same way that I do. Those who follow God get the majors right. We still want to get the minors right too, but we understand what's most important. Instead of focusing on the minor things that allow me to not have to change any of the big things in my heart and life. Next, we see Jesus tell us that hypocrisy focuses on the outside things. It emphasizes the outward things. Look in verse 25. What sorrow awaits you, teachers of religious law, and you Pharisees, hypocrites! You are so careful to clean the outside of the cup and the dish, but inside you are filthy, full of greed and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first wash the inside of the cup and the dish, and then the outside will become clean too. What sorrow awaits you, teachers of religious law, and you Pharisees, hypocrites! For you are like whitewashed tombs, beautiful on the outside, but filled on the inside with dead people's bones and all sorts of impurity. Outwardly you look like righteous people, but inwardly your hearts are filled with hypocrisy and lawlessness. So Jesus said they're focused on cleaning the outside, and the Pharisees actually debated whether you had to clean the inside of a cup or the outside of the cup first, and which was more important to be clean. And Jesus is saying, with your lives, all you do is clean the outside of the cup, but you don't clean the inside. So imagine that. We've all probably had this happen. You put a dish in the dishwasher, right? And you pull it out, and the outside of the bowl is nice and clean, but inside is still like caked in some of the pasta from last night, right? Didn't get cleaned out well. So imagine if you looked at that and said, well, the outside's clean, and then you just pour your Fruit Loops and milk inside of it and just eat away. Then you put it back in the washing machine. In the dishwasher, again, it cleans the outside real well, but now you got pasta and Fruit Loops inside of there, all caked in, all hardened. And you figure, well, the outside's clean, so my soup will be fine in there, right? And you just, every day, day after day, you keep eating, and you keep caking on more filth on the inside, but hey, the outside's clean. Anybody want to sign up for that? No. And yet, so often, that's exactly what we do when we live for God. We just make sure on the outside we look nice and shiny for everyone else to see. And we haven't done anything to make sure that our hearts are clean. And we keep pouring things into our hearts and wonder why they get filthier and filthier. And wonder why they get harder and harder. We're concerned about the outside, what people see, and not the inside, what God sees. He talks then about how they are whitewashed tombs. Tombs made you unclean. The Pharisees were obsessed with whether things were clean. The last time Jesus pointed out this example of them straining out a gnat, if a fly flew in your drink, if it died in your drink, it made it unclean. Right? If it flew in and you got it out before it died, you were okay. So they're obsessed with getting these bugs out because you didn't want to ruin a good glass of wine. So it was okay then. They said if a bug is smaller than a lentil, you can't really see that. So if that gets in your wine and it dies, you're fine. Bigger than that, you got to get it out. Well, the Pharisees, because they were holier, said that's not good enough. They made this gauze, and they would pour their wine through it to try and strain out every little gnat. So they could say, see, we don't even swallow those gnats. That's how clean we are. And Jesus told him, you don't swallow the gnats, but you eat the camels, right? You care about the little things, but don't pay attention to the big things. But they're obsessed with cleanliness. So they would even go and they would paint and clean, whitewash tombs. One, so that you would know that they were there. So, because if you walk by, if your shadow touched a tomb, it made you unclean. We can't even have my shadow touch it. So but they wanted to make them look good. They wanted the tomb to look pretty. And Jesus is saying, you are painting headstones and forgetting what's inside is still dead. It doesn't change anything. You keep painting your hearts and it's empty and dead inside. Is it fine to whitewash the tomb? Sure. But don't think it changes anything about what's inside of it. So clean yourself up on the outside all you want. If you're still dead on the inside, none of that matters. And hypocrisy cares more about the paint job on our tombs than it does about whether we're dead or alive in our hearts. Last thing Jesus says is that hypocrisy rejects the truth. You can start reading in verse 29, and we won't read this, but Jesus tells them here about their ancestors and how their ancestors, every time would send them a prophet, they would kill him. And this was a point of pride of the Pharisees. The Pharisees said, we've never done that. We are so much better than our forefathers. Jesus says this in the last week of his life. This is days before he goes to the cross. So this is both a judgment and a prophecy where Jesus is telling them, you are going to do exactly what your ancestors did. God has sent you a prophet to tell you the truth. And instead of listening to him, and instead of change, you're going to kill him. And he's going to die. So that you don't have to face the truth. Hypocrisy rejects the truth. It does anything it can to get rid of it. And so we have to look at our lives and say, how have I knowingly or unknowingly rejected the truth that God is trying to feed me, that God is trying to give to me, that God is trying to bring to me? What messengers in my life am I killing? Am I pushing away? Am I not listening to? Because if I listen to them, I have to change. If I listen to them, something has to be different. How do I know what God is bringing to me and know that it's what should change me inside? And how do I know what shouldn't? How do I know it's from the world and not from him? Those are the standards of hypocrisy. What do we allow the truth to change us, to saturate our hearts, to move our lives? Or do we kill the truth and reject it so that I can be who I want to be instead of become who God wants me to be? The Queen Mary was once the largest ship to cross the oceans. And it survived many years. It survived 4 decades, including World War. And it served from 1936 until it retired. It was this well-known ship. It's anchored now in Long Beach, California. And when they moved it to Long Beach, they were making it into like a museum, and they wanted to make hotel rooms and stuff, and it's still there. They still are trying to do things with this boat. But when they brought it in, they had to renovate it. It still needed to float, but now they needed to make it for people to walk through it. They wanted it to be this museum, this tourist attraction. So one of the first things they did, you see there's 3 large smokestacks. They took those smokestacks off, and they put them on the dock, and they wanted to strip them down so they could repair the steel. It was 3/4-inch steel that was underneath there. They want to repair them, make them look great. They wouldn't have to sail anymore. They wouldn't have to go on the sea anymore. They could survive for a long time. So they take the smokestacks off, they put them down, and they began to strip the paint away. You know what they found? There was no steel left. The smokestacks were 30 coats of paint that had been put on the Queen Mary over the years. But literally all the steel had rusted away. Looked like a smokestack, painted it up so it looked nice and pretty, but on the inside, nothing was left. All paint, no steel. And what Jesus is saying to us today, friends, is there's many people who come in his name who are just like these smokestacks. We're all paint. We've prettied ourselves up on the outside so that everybody else thinks that we are who we say we are. But on the inside, it's empty. It's dead. There's nothing of God in there. There's a deep emptiness and hypocrisy, especially if you are as self-deceived as the Pharisees were. You work so hard to keep up that exterior display. You were constantly throwing new coats of paint on because what matters to you the most is what people think of you, not what God knows of you. Jesus, at the end of his judgment here, listen to this, he finishes this passage looking out on Jerusalem. In verse 37, he says, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones God's messengers, how often have I wanted to gather your children together as a hen protects her chicks beneath her wings, but you wouldn't let me. And now, look, your house is abandoned and desolate. For I tell you this, you will never see me again until you say, blessings on the one who comes in the name of the Lord." This passage happens, I told you, during the last week of Jesus' life. In Matthew, the last week of Jesus' life begins with him going to the temple. He sees what happens in the temple, and then he goes back and he overturns the temple tables. And so here, when he talks about their house being abandoned and desolate, he's talking about the temple. He's condemning the temple. This temple, this is Passover week. It is bustling. It is filled with people. It is filled with life. There's more people than at any other time than there ever is right there in that temple. And Jesus says it's empty and desolate. Why? Because it's filled with people and it's empty of God. His house, he says, is a den of thieves, a kingdom of hypocrites, and there is no room for God there anymore. And I wonder if it was the new temple, which is our hearts. That's where God lives now. If he was looking at our temple, what words would he speak over it? Is it full of his life, or is it abandoned and desolate? What would he speak over our families? Are they full of him? Or are they abandoned and desolate and empty of him? What would he speak of our churches and our denominations? Are we filled with him, or are we empty and desolate and have deceived ourselves into thinking that we are something that we are not? He speaks those words because these people are so prideful. They're selfish. They're deceived. They believe that they are who God wants them to be, but they are blind to what God really wants from them. There is no room in their hearts for God because their hearts are too full of themselves. So I want you to hear this today. So call the worship team forward. We'll sing this last song as our prayer. So often we hear that, and what we say is, fine, I'm going to clean up a little bit of my heart, and I'm going to make room for God. I'm going to clean up some of who I am, and there'll be room for him to move in. Don't waste your time. You're cleaning the outside of the cup. You can't clean the inside. You can't be good enough or righteous enough or holy enough. There's not enough oregano you can tithe to make room for God in your life. You can do all the right things, but you can't clean your heart. Cleaning yourself up on the outside never makes room for God on the inside. So instead of cleaning our hearts, the only thing that we can do is to give our hearts to him. And he tells us not that he cleans our hearts up, but he gives us a new heart. He gives us his heart. And then we can follow him. Then we can be filled with him. Then we can find his life. So as we sing these words today, they proclaim, here's my heart, Lord. If you haven't done that, if you haven't given up your heart to him so that he can make your heart his, so that he can make room for him in your life, don't wait another second to do it. Don't fool yourself into thinking you can live your way out of it. You can't. Only He, the one who created you, can make you into who you are created and purposed to be in Christ Jesus. You don't have to do anything but ask for Him to do it. It'll change your hearts and make you His. You don't have to pretend anymore. You can be as broken and as empty as you are. He doesn't care. He doesn't need you to be anything other than willing to let Him work in your life. So give Him your heart and let Him change you. And as it changes us, we'll change the world around us. Let's stand and sing and give Him our hearts today.